Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Liam O Mahony. Was that close-ish?
Good.
All right,
That's good.
that's cool. It's a good job. I'm not going to have to say the second name again. I can just say Liam from now. So that makes my life easier
Absolutely.
for the next hour or so. Um, so Liam and I spoke a couple of weeks ago now, well, last week I think, and I asked him this question about to what extent does the word healing resonate with him, and you said that you felt it was kind of overused, it had become a bit of a buzzword, a bit of a cliche, and you said instead that you prefer to look at five different things. So
Yeah.
what are the five different things, Liam?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say, Simon, is that, thanks for inviting me on. It's great to be on here.
You're very
And
welcome.
I think healing definitely is I think it's after becoming a buzzword, it's become very generalized. Now, the first thing I would say is that I think if you look at healing as a verb versus as looking at healing as a noun, it kind of makes more sense to me that it's a process, and that it's something that I believe anyway that I'll be healing to the day I die. And a lot of adoptees that I work with, they would feel the same. So I think looking at it as a verb versus a noun is just very kind of helpful. Because if it becomes a noun, it becomes a thing, and we lose track then of what healing actually might look like. So I suppose, like, I'll just tell you, I'll just say something about, in kind of general, what I think, what my own healing has looked like, and the people I work with, and then the five things that we spoke about. I like to look at them as a kind of an expression of healing.
Okay.
And, if these five things are happening in a person's life, I think then they're in that kind of process of healing. Now I think so. So in general, when I kind of look at my own healing, and when I look at people I work with, like I have a kind of a phrase that I use as a kind of a general phrase. And I think for healing to be kind of deep, then I think what we're doing is we're reclaiming our embodied voice. And I'd say that again because I think it's an important phrase. We're reclaiming our embodied voice. Because often, I know, like, if you think about it, our story or our narrative without experience is kind of meaningless. And a lot of, say for me, and I don't know, would you agree with this, Simon? But for a lot of people I work with, or or adoption experience happened at a time, what they call in psychology, a time of implicit memory. So what implicit memory is, it's embodied memory. So a lot of our story, a lot of adoptee story is in our bodies, not in our minds. And we often, we often get a story in our minds, or we get a kind of a story or a narrative, you know, maybe from a third party. We might get parts of our story from our adopted parents. We might get parts of our story from tracing. We might get parts of our stories from a lot of different ways, which is, all very helpful. But I think, for deeper healing and for more meaningful healing, we really kind of need to kind of listen to that embodied voice, and that part of us that is, kind of that baby part of us, that kind of fetus part of us, that is, that is often for the adoptees kind of stuck in a different kind of consciousness. And in a way, we need to kind of, to heal, it's about reclaiming that voice, really. So that's it in general. So, like, if someone was kind of on the road to healing then, or in the kind of a process of healing, what would that look like? And I think that there's where the five things come in, Simon. For me, the five expressions of healing might be a good way of saying it. Is the first is that because, again, it happened at such a kind of a young age when we were kind of, very young, I think kind of adoption has the potential to leave a kind of real, what you might call a relational rupture. So for me, certainly there was a kind of a very deep mistrust to people that I had all my life. So the first thing I'd see with, when a person's on the road to healing is that relationally things get better. So our relationships are, or you could say they get deeper, they get more emotional, they get more satisfying, they get more kind of meaningful. And certainly there's more kind of intimacy in relationships. And in a way, I suppose a kind of an easy way of saying it, Simon, is that we begin to leave other people matter to us, and we begin to leave other people in at an emotional kind of level. So that's the first. The second, I suppose, kind of rupture that I call it a kind of a regulation rupture. Usually, again, the experience of adoption is that adoptees in their adult life will have kind of difficulties or challenges with autonomic regulation, emotional regulation, cognitive regulation. A lot of adoptees that I work with have had kind of dependencies on alcohol, dependencies on food addictions, but others that have kind of addiction then to overworking, addiction to status, addiction to how other people see them. So there can be kind of a real kind of challenge in kind of regulating what goes on inside them. So they'll either be over emotional, they'll be kind of, when I say over emotion, overwhelmed by emotion, or they'll be absolutely cut off from emotion. And so when you see, so the second sign I think of people healing is that they begin to have better regulation. They're not as dependent on kind of substances. They're not as dependent on people. They're not as dependent on maybe work or status to keep themselves regulated. So really kind of important. So the third part, I suppose, Simon, is that I think we talked a little bit about this last week, is that because again of, you could say the adoption experiences, adoptees potentially again, and I would have been like this, and a lot of people I work with would be like this. We can be very sensitive to how other people see us. So adoptees potentially can have a very kind of hostile relationship with themselves. So they can relate to themselves in ways that kind of go from being critical of themselves to actually downright hatred of themselves. And then, of course, when you relate to yourself in such a hostile way, and this kind of ties in with the first kind of point that we talked about, it's very hard to sit with another human being because that's what we project onto another human being. Then if I see myself in a kind of hugely negative way, then Simon is going to see myself in a hugely negative way. So the third part of healing is that adoptees start relating to themselves with more kind of gentleness, more kind of kindness. And in a way they can kind of look back at their lives, and usually if you kind of relate yourself in a very hostile way, life will be kind of challenging in lots of different ways. And they can kind of even relate then to their 16-year-old self, their baby self, their, whatever, in a more kind of gentle way, so that that hostility kind of softens and there's a more gentle, a more kind kindness, a more kind of nurturing relationship with themselves, Simon. So that would be the third. The fourth then would be you potentially again with adoption, it can leave our nervous systems in a heightened state. So with adoptees, you could have somebody that's with quite a lot of vigilance. And if you're somebody that has quite a lot of vigilance, rest is going to be really hard. Now, you might be someone that can sleep a lot, but sleep and rest are two different things. So you might, I remember in my 20s, I'd often go to bed at 12 in the day, and at 12 at night, sorry, and I might get up on 12 in the day. But when I get up, I'd nearly have to fall asleep again. So I could sleep plenty, but I never felt rested, never felt rejuvenated after waking. So it can be really hard for adoptees to tolerate rest. So a real kind of sign that, people are healing is that if they're resting more. They're resting more, and when they do wake, they feel rejuvenated. And of course, the big one then, Simon, again, the big part of that then is they're able to rest in relationships more. That relationships are not so kind of tiring, and that they can actually feel kind of rejuvenated from relationships. Because often adoptees will, in the context of relationships, will be absolutely exhausted after relationships because there's so much kind of effort and so much pressurizing themselves in relationships. So that's the fourth. The fifth then is usually, because of the adoption experience again, and potentially, you know, the kind of states that kind of adoptees can be kind of familiar with is certainly anxiety, certainly kind of depression, certainly numbing themselves, dissociation. And in a way, then that becomes nearly the kind of safe state, even though it's a kind of an uncomfortable and unfamiliar, it becomes safe. So their kind of capacity to kind of feel, you could say, more expansive states like joy, like vitality, like aliveness is very underdeveloped. So when you kind of, so so you could say the kind of ability to kind of experience simple human pleasure gets underdeveloped. So again, the fifth part is that when adoptees kind of start, being able to tolerate being alive more, to tolerate joy more, tolerate feeling happy more, they're on the road to healing then. So they're the five.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. Can I take you back to the driver of these signs? Yeah.
Yeah,
You talked about reclaiming our embodied voice.
yeah,
So we've got you're alluding to a mismatch here between our truth and other people's truth.
potentially, yeah,
Um, I, I was getting kind of bits of Bessel van der Kolk as you were talking about this, as you were talking about the implicit memory
Mm.
and the trauma being stuck in our bodies.
Yeah.
Um, the bit that I'd like to ask you about is you talked about reclaiming our embodied voice. Is that about uh, speaking our truth rather than somebody else's truth? Is that about putting words to what was previously pre-verbal? What?
I think it can be both of them. Like if you think of implicit memory is made up of bodily sensations. It's kind of made up of surges of emotion. It's made up of behavioral impulses. It's made up of intentions. So the experience of adoption, as you're kind of nicely putting it, is a kind of embodied experience. So the body needs to so we have a kind of a story that, you know, there can be, as you say, it's mismatch, but it's a story that we get from someone else usually. But the story of the body then is very different, because if you think about it, like if adoption for me was a very kind of traumatic experience, so if it is a traumatic experience for adoptee, then our body, in response to that experience or experiences, will organize in a very kind of particular way, which we then kind of need to live with. So we kind of learn kind of various kind of protections and various strategies to kind of disconnect from. So we so there's a story, there's a very specific story in that organization that is always looking to be told, and that's going to be very individual for every person. That might be, you know, that might be kind of sounds coming out of your body, kind of pre-verbal screams. That'd be kind of certainly what I find a lot with me, and I find a lot with adoptees. That can be a kind of a level of rage that can kind of feel very frightening. That can be kind of deep, kind of grief. That can, that's very kind of enlivening, really, but that can be really kind of buried at a very deep level inside us. And when these experiences start coming out, there can be, as you say, kind of, we can put words on experiences, that, it includes terror, I think. Like, I remember being in counseling for a long time, and after many years in counseling, I started getting panic attacks. So it'll come out for each person in a very kind of different way, and you you have a very different story, and it's a real kind of, I think it's a real kind of honoring of that kind of baby part of us, that has been kind of stuck in a kind of a different consciousness for a long time, and he or she then will be able to tell a different story to potentially what we've been told.
Yeah. So I'm getting story on a couple of different levels here, as in stories like tell me the story of your adoption, that story. But I'm also getting the idea that the body's telling a story through its actions.
Absolutely.
And as you were talking about howling, did you say how? Did you use it?
Yeah, it could be kind of, there could be kind of like often one of the things I hear is kind of people letting out kind of primal screams that have been kind of trapped in the body for a long time. Now that's not everybody, but that's another kind
Yeah.
of potential.
I've done that.
Yeah.
I've done that. I remember a conversation with my dad, my adopted dad, about a work issue, a really tricky work a crisis. Yeah, let's call it, because that's what it felt like at the time to me, crisis. And I went to him for help, and he sounded like he was listening, and he made some suggestions, and I said, well, that's not going to work because of this, this, and this. Um, this is probably 25 years ago now, this is happening. But I still remember it, right? And so he kind of took my points on board, and we moved on to some other ideas that we had. And then and then he brought it back round to the ideas that we'd already kind of put to one side. And I remember a primal scream, because of anguish at him not understanding. Um, I can remember having one of those primal screams probably, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago on my own, just walking the dog when I was kind of very overloaded with, um, overwhelmed and overloaded about, and confused about what I did next with a certain issue. And I gave one of those on my own. But so it's funny. And I also love Primal Scream, the band, right? So, I'm kind of getting that. So you're talking about a story here, that our body's telling um, a story through its actions, that is not a verbal story. So I'm guessing a lot of your work is somatic. It's got a big somatic base to it. Is
Yeah,
that?
absolutely. You see, I think one of the one of the things I've found, again, from my own experience and working with people, is that, again, potentially, and I don't want to say this is everybody, but like the experience of adoption and the experience of kind of separation from our kind of birth mother, and depending on the context of our birth and a lot of things, there's a part of us kind of trapped in, back there, trapped in a different state of consciousness. So, you know, you could kind of talk about it till the cows come home, and it wouldn't make, it wouldn't make any difference. But, where the part of us that's trapped is embodied. So in a way, what we're doing is we're kind of helping, over time, that part of us to kind of find find its way home in a way. In a way, it's very kind of sacred, because it's kind of interesting. I did, I don't know if a lot of adoptees would kind of relate to this, but I would have a real kind of lack of recall for a lot of my childhood experiences. There's a lot gone, there's years that I have no kind of memory of. And again, that's not too unusual for the people I work with as well. So I'd say people would probably relate to that. But there's one thing I always remember. I remember when I was kind of young, I don't know, I was probably only about 8 or 9, and I remember kind of watching this film, and at the time I didn't have the language for this, but in a way kind of resonating deeply with the film. And the film it was by an actor, you probably know him, John Travolta. And the film was called The Boy in the Bubble. And The Boy in the Bubble is essentially about if I can remember correctly now, about this guy. He has this kind of illness where the air outside, if he gets too much of the air, he dies. So the only way he can kind of stay alive is in a bubble. And looking back, I could relate to that so much, because there was a part of me kind of stuck in a bubble, kind of trapped, trapped in embodied in a kind of repressed. And that's what that's what the work is, the kind of healing for me is, that we're trying to, very gently and very kind of, in a way, kind of gently, certainly, in a very kind of, maybe kind of titrated way, I suppose is the word. We're helping the kind of boy to come out of the bubble. And that's why, the somatic part of the work is kind of really kind of important, because there can be, there can be words and there can be kind of sounds. So we're given that, we're kind of releasing that kind of embodied kind of voice, really.
So does this relate to um, being more at large in the world rather than, in your first comment, you talked about mistrust of others.
Yeah,
So I'm gonna, like just simplifying it for me, I'm gonna say, right, I'm gonna stay in my bubble because I don't want to come in, I don't want to come out of my bubble because I don't trust you.
yeah. Sorry, one second. My phone is going off there for some reason. Apologies, Simon.
No worries.
Turn this off now. I thought I turned it off. No. Yeah, off now. My apologies.
No worries. So we stay in the bubble because the bubble's safe,
Yeah,
and we don't want other people coming into our bubble
yeah,
because we're lacking in trust of them. And maybe, I never spoke to my dad about that primal scream moment that I had with him. Um, we didn't touch on anything tricky, like, which kind of relates to your second point. Well, no, deeper it's the same point actually. Having a deeper conversation. I just don't think I didn't know how to have that conversation, and he clearly didn't. He just took the warning sign, and then we moved on. We never revisited um, that conversation. So I'm mentioning this quite a lot at the moment on the podcast because it seemed something big for me, and I've not really got my handle on it. So I'd love your insight on this. So this was something that I heard from Gabor Mate a couple of months ago when he said that um, the feeling of not being enough, the feeling of being unworthy, the feeling of being less than. I'm not sure exactly which word he used out of those, or maybe something different, but that sort of thing. He said, not feeling enough isn't actually a feeling, it's a belief that we're not enough.
mm, yeah, yeah,
And I'm wondering how these two things, how you see these two things sitting together, this non-verbal trauma that's non-verbal apart from primal screams, right? That's stuck in our body, that's embodied. How that sits with this feeling of not being enough, and does one come from the other? How do these two things sit together? Because one's clearly very visceral, and the other one uh, seems to me anyway to be more cognitive, to be more to do with thought.
Yeah, absolutely. So like if you think about the way I kind of explain it is that if we go back to kind of implicit memory, and if you think of like if we give one example, say like if like if you think about the experience of adoption, and one of the kind of possibilities that, you know, and that happened to me and that happened to a lot of adoptees, is that there can be a lot of kind of big emotions involved, of not being, like, one of the things that I would kind of say happens for adoptees, that in my experience, it either happens or there's certainly a perception of it happening anyway, is it's the experience of not being welcomed into the world. Yeah. So when we're, as a child, when we're not welcomed into the world, the first kind of reaction, and it's a kind of an organic reaction, you might call it kind of protest. You'd hear the child kind of protesting, yeah, you know, kind of giving out, you know, that they have a particular need or whatever, yeah. And if the protest then is not met, what usually happens, the protest ramps up to anger, yeah. And then if the anger is not met, the anger ramps up to rage, yeah. But it's not kind of sustainable for children or infants to kind of live in a kind of state of kind of rage, because it's, you know, it's just too dysregulating from their body, and as well then, you know, they can be afraid of kind of retaliation, and so they kind of need to find, you know, one of the things that happens then, so you have this kind of big feeling of rage, or you might have a big feeling of, you know, grief or kind of sadness. So infants then, and then children, they need to find a way of kind of going on with life and not being connected to these big feelings, or not being connected to these, you know, whatever, these impulses to reach out, or, yeah. So the first survival response that's available to him, Simon, is that from a very young age, we can kind of shut down. Yeah, you're probably familiar with the polyvagal theory, and so we have four different responses in our nervous system. We have social engagement or safety, we have fight, flight, shut down. Yeah, so we can shut down. So young children will, and, you know, adoptees, I come across this response a lot in adoptees, and you know, I know this response very well myself. So we start shutting down. So we start shutting down that high sympathetic charge of kind of rage or anger. So that the shutdown then kind of binds that, yeah? And we have kind of two responses in our nervous system. Then we have that high activation and we have that shutdown. So these responses of kind of fight, flight, and freeze are only supposed to be used in kind of, you know, very kind of serious circumstances, really, life or death. But what adoptees will do, they start using them kind of habitually, just to kind of shut down them kind of early, kind of overwhelming emotions. And what happens then, you know, as we get older, if you think about then, as we get older, and this is, a lot of this is unconscious, adoptees kind of, one of the ways we kind of do it is through the body again, of course. So the body goes into kind of deep patterns of bracing, deep patterns of contraction, deep patterns of shutting down. And then the developing personality, the personality of the child, when kind of cognition comes more online, has to make kind of sense of this kind of dysregulation. And often, again, because of the immature kind of, thinking capacity of children, I feel bad, because there's so much dysregulation in our body, often translates to I am bad. So what's essentially a kind of bodily kind of response now becomes a cognitive idea or a cognitive belief about ourselves. So all this kind of dysregulation in our body, because of these earlier experiences of I feel bad, becomes I am bad. So that's one way. And the other thing then that often happens to infants again and children because of their immature kind of thinking capacity is when our say our parent or adopted parent or birth mother or whatever can't respond to us, the child goes into what you might call is a kind of splitting dynamic. So children can kind of hold a complexity of emotion. So often what children will do when the environment is not able to respond to their needs is they'll split the parent or the caregiver between a good mother, bad mother, and themselves, a good child, bad child. And again, because we depend on our parents for so much, it's much better for a child to be a bad child with good parents than to be a good child with bad parents. So we take on this kind of idea or belief about ourselves that we're bad because that lets us hope, because hope that we can become good and be accepted then. So if you think about it, these kind of embodied experiences of kind of dysregulation, of distress, lead to these kind of ideas or these beliefs about ourselves.
Yeah.
That makes sense?
I think so. And I can see bits bits of myself in there. I'm I'm thinking what back to that word that you used of reclaiming our uh, our embodied voice. If that is the if that and it's a verb, right? Like so, like healing's a verb, reclaiming. What's the fuel that we use? What's our fuel? What's the driver? What's the driver of our reclamation, of our reclaiming this stuff?
Um, well, I kind of think of two things straight away. Like, if you think of, if you ever kind of when you're working with people, say if you're working with people that are, you know, adopted or kind of working with people with developmental trauma, it's easy to kind of see the woundedness and the kind of, the hurt parts of them. But there's also the other side where we have a huge kind of amount of what's called inherent health. And inherent health in a way means that we have huge biological and organic resources. So we're like what's part of our biology, like, is that we'll always kind of orientate to the warmest possible relationships, no matter how traumatized we've been. When that warm person, that loving person turns up, our kind of biology will start orientating to that. So I think that's one driver, in a sense of you know, we have a lot of these organic resources that are always kind of a bit like a flower. If you think of a flower, will always kind of orientate towards sunlight, yeah? So or kind of or organismic self, you might call, always kind of is always looking for healing, and always kind of looking certainly to kind of people that, that can support that kind of healing. Because if you think about it, I do a lot of work in addiction, and sometimes we, in our society now, when people have any kind of, mental health problems like kind of anxiety or depression, sometimes, certainly here in Ireland, there can be an over-reliance on medication. But see, one of the problems with medication, and, there's lots of kind of pluses for medication, but like medication kind of numbs us, but it can never numb us fully, because that part of us, that wants to kind of live in the kind of midst of our birthright, is always, it's like a compass. It's always kind of looking for, where we kind of should be. So I'd see that as kind of a big kind of driver. And you know but sometimes, I think the big, and I don't know, did you mean this by the question, but I think the big kind of driver as well is that is something kind of, I think, around relationships. When we kind of when we find relationships that where people can relate to us in a kind of a certain way, can relate to us with kind of a love and presence, relate to us with gentleness, with warmth. I think that kind of actualizes something in us as well. That's a kind of a driver towards kind of health. So I think the two of them.
Yeah. You've used the word consciousness, and that word means different things to different people. Have you come across this uh the David Hawkins scale of consciousness? Have you come across that?
No.
No. Okay. Have you come across this this idea that consciousness is the space in which our sensations and our feelings happen in the same way as the movie on a screen? This non. Some people look at this. This is what the guy I listen to all the time at the moment is a guy called Rupert Spira. He's talking about it's being instead of focusing on the content of our experience, we focus on the context of it, the knowing of it. And is this ringing any bells for you?
Well, I kind of use consciousness in a kind of I'll explain it for myself. And we had a conversation last week, and I think you used the kind of term coming out of the fog. yeah,
Yeah.
which which is kind of a term that I hadn't heard that much before. And but for me, coming out of the fog kind of started like I'm 54 now, probably when I was about 40. And it was a kind of a visual experience. I was telling you last time that, when I was 40, I started seeing the world in a different way. And I'm actually visually different in that if I met you kind of say 14 years ago, when I'd be looking at you, it would be like both of us were inside in a steam room.
Yeah.
And often over the years, it would feel that a bit like the bubble, that there was some part of me kind of looking out of me from a different consciousness inside. And and often what kind of happens, when I kind of work with adoptees is that sometimes with adoption and with developmental trauma, the experiences can be so kind of challenging and can be so you know, difficult that sometimes you get adoptees that actually never embody, that it's just too kind of painful to come into their bodies. And what happens is that they they have kind of access to consciousnesses or kind of more, you might call them esoteric realms that kind of normal folks don't have. So that's what I kind of mean by kind of, for me, kind of consciousness, really.
Yeah. So I had you heard of Eckhart Tolle? Have you
Yeah,
heard? Yeah.
yeah.
So I was reading his book, the one of the big ones, The Power of Now, which I think was his first big one. Um, this would be maybe 20 years ago, and um, I was reading about his awakening, and the following day, I was sat in I was on holiday in Turkey, and uh, and suddenly all the colors were ramped up, right? So like on a like when you change the color knob on your television, right? So the blue went from an insipid blue to a really bright blue, of the sea, the yellow of the yellow of the because it was August in Turkey, the yellow of the ground became far richer and more vibrant, and I became aware of the sound of the wind blowing in the straw roof of the beach hut. Right?
Mm.
And that was a shift. That was a shift in my vision in the same way as talking as you had a shift in your vision. So coming out of the fog wasn't just metaphorical for you. It was actual. It was a physical kind of lived thing. Uh,
Absolutely.
and I'm also thinking about a woman that yeah, I was sharing some of my learnings. This wasn't in the adoption space, uh, but we were touching quite a space. And uh, she was a Muslim. She had a headdress on, and and traditionally, like hair, ladies' hair is important to me, like in terms of their I don't know, like come across, yeah, in terms of their look, like I think of Sophie Loren or something, when I was a kid and, there's the dark hair and, I always associate people's, hair, ladies' hair with their part of their important part of their looks to me. And she suddenly became vibrantly, I was just talking about some deep stuff, some Eckhart Tolle stuff or something like that. And she suddenly became, she became kind of beautiful to me, and she hadn't been before. So there's this altered different states of consciousness um, that are very visual.
Yeah.
Um, and I hadn't heard anybody express it like that before. So let me try one of this Rupert Spira guy, a metaphor that would be similar to what he would say. And I'd love your opinion on this, right? So I love to look at the metaphors and then extend them, right? So when when we come out of the fog, uh, what did you see when you came out of the fog?
Um, it was kind of like my story is kind of is very interesting. And I'd love to. I haven't had anybody kind of and I'm sure there is people. So if anybody is listening on the call and they have experiences like I had, please contact me because it's really it's really nice to have a kind of a subgroup of people that you can identify with. But coming out of the fog was problematic for me in a sense of that I don't know if you kind of if you have ever heard of a therapy called internal family systems.
Yes, yeah.
So IFS and in IFS they have a term, it's called internal voice. So when I started coming out of the fog about 40, I started hearing a lot of internal voices that up to that point in my life I had never heard. So I would I would hear I'm going to kill myself. I would hear I want to die. I would hear I'm going to kill you, you bastard. Yeah. And even though, up to that point in my life, up to 40, I had, challenges like a lot of adoptees can have. But, suicidal ideation was never a part of my life. So here I was like, and I'd be sitting down with clients, and if Simon was my client, I'd be kind of sitting across from Simon, and next to all, I'd hear inside myself, I'm going to kill myself. I wish you were dead, you bastard. And I'd start getting these images then, very very kind of violent images. So I'd get images of babies being chopped up and kind of thrown into a furnace, something
Wow.
that I, you know, I'm nearly sure I probably never saw, but they were kind of probably more kind of symbolic, kind of implicit memory. So so some so so that was they were kind of challenges, they were kind of real kind of challenges because I didn't have I didn't kind of have a subgroup, of people that could kind of relate to that. And you know, and you see you couldn't tell that to everybody. Because I told it to some people and they kind of framed it in a way that I was kind of psychiatric, that I was hearing voices. But I knew that wasn't the case because, so that was part of me coming out of the fog. I think coming out of the fog was kind of difficult as well because even at 40 and years after, I had kind of years of counselling behind me. And then suddenly I started getting panic attacks. For years as a counsellor, I didn't really understand panic attacks because I never had them. Because I was so I kind of shut down so much, I think, in my younger life that I was kind of in this, what you might call a kind of a functional freeze. But after about, I always kind of laugh with my wife because maybe after about, I don't know, 15 years of counselling, I started getting panic attacks. I started experiencing kind of levels of kind of terror that I'd never experienced in my life. I actually thought that I was going to die, that it was kind of all over for me. And even though I had
Mm.
lots of experience of counselling and lots of counselling behind me, for about probably lasted about 4 months, it was very kind of hard to see the wood for the trees. So they were definitely kind of experiences that were difficult. But I think coming out of fog as well, was kind of there was a lot of kind of really kind of rich experiences in a sense that, I began to be able to tolerate kind of, sitting with people more and more, um, kind of, having kind of deeper relationships with people, having more meaningful relationships with people, kind of, you know, kind of getting a tribe around me in a way that
Yeah.
could kind of support my kind of development. So I think they'd be some of the experiences.
Yeah. So, I mean, you talk about a subgroup. So there's an American podcaster, adoption podcaster, well, she's an adopted mum, and she's called Beth Siverson, and she just released a book with co-authors, right? So different people have written different um, chapters, and I think it's called Adoptees and Suicidality, something like that. So I'm saying that listeners, in case you haven't heard of that and you want to check that book out, and you want to check her out. So she's called Beth Siverson, as I say, adopted mum, and the podcast is called Unraveling Adoption. So that might be worth listening. That might be worth you looking at. Or I can make an introduction if you want that too. She's a great lady, and that might be the work. Worth the listeners looking at. I think, that so the coming out of the fog was very is becoming aware of the trauma and our brains maybe of our bodies or whatever. It's been hidden. We haven't seen it, and then it kind of comes up, and that's why it's so violent. It's like
Yeah.
a
That's
jolt.
a challenge for people, really, Simon, is that, you know, see, even therapy, adoptees will often go to therapy and they might actually get more kind of symptomatic in therapy. So, like, because, like, if you think about it, one of the primary ways that I see, adoptees coping is by going into that kind of deep kind of collapse, shutdown response,
Yeah,
and then kind of the dissociative kind of lifestyle that comes with that. And you see, what good therapy will do is it'll start kind of supporting you to come out of the kind of the dissociative kind of shutdown response. But the challenge in that is that as you come out, you'll meet everything that put you into it in the first place.
yeah.
And for me,
That's scary. Yeah.
that being
Very
the
scary. Terrifying. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
terrifying and the panic and the, very high levels of kind of fear, and so that
yeah.
can be a challenging part of the process, really.
So how would you put what you just shared there? And thank you for sharing that. Uh, it's powerful, very powerful. So how would you put that with this essential idea that you started out with of reclaiming our embodied narrative? How would you wrap those two things together?
Well, you see, in a way, is how I'd wrap them together is that reclaiming our embodied voice also potentially means reclaiming our family's embodied voice. So
The generational trauma, is that what you
the
mean?
generational trauma. So like who, like for me, who's that voice? Who's the voice of the one that wants to kill themselves? Because, suicidal ideation has never been part of my life. So who's the one that wants to die? And, I can be
Wow.
fairly sure that that's my birth mother and that's my kind of, you know, grandmother, because my grandmother, what I found out later, spent a lot of her life in an asylum. So you can imagine the despair of, kind of spending your life in a kind of psychiatric hospital, especially at that time. And then my mother was so kind of wounded. So potential, so that's how we wrap it up. When you
Wow.
reclaim your own embodied voice, you're you're reclaiming the voice of those who went before you as well,
Yeah.
which is very powerful, but very difficult.
Powerful, painful, yeah, at the same time. Um, I actually saw a book on generational trauma the other day, and I thought, shall I have a dive into that or not? And I decided not to. Have you seen anything on that? I'm thinking I might give it another go, actually. Have you seen a book on generational trauma?
Um, I have I have a good few of them, but I'll email. I can't think of them now, but
Okay.
I'll definitely
Yeah, that's great.
email.
Okay. And if you, I'll add them to the show notes.
Okay.
So if any listeners want to dive into it, yeah, cool. Wow. Thank you very much. Sorry, as always, listeners, check out the show notes for links to Liam website and stuff. But before I finish, I just want to ask thank you again, and also to just ask you, is there anything else you want to share that I've not asked you about?
Um, well, I think the only other two things that I share that is kind of, I think we touched on them. I think, if I looking back and if I think is kind of helpful for, adoptees is that, we talked a lot about kind of, different consciousness. And one of the things, if we have a part of ourselves in a different kind of consciousness, then we need to kind of watch our kind of rhythm. And often, and especially our rhythm of contact with people. So often adoptees will kind of go too fast through life, too fast through relationships. So I'd say kind of find your rhythm. Just it seemed to be really important for me.
Yeah.
Because we can go kind of too fast or too slow as a kind of a protection, but really kind of finding your rhythm, that would be one thing. And the other thing I'd say that, again, this is at the top of myself and kind of a lot of people I've worked with, is with this early kind of trauma, we can have a lot of kind of hostility inside ourselves, a lot of kind of rage, a lot of hostility. Some of it can be our own about what happened to us, and we can, internalize some of it from the environments we've been in as well. And I think, and some of that can be very kind of covert, that we can kind of, as a protection, we can come across as very kind of pleasing and very, easygoing. But, the hostility can be really kind of very deep, I think, in adoptees. And what I'd say about that is that, that's very normal. And we want to be kind of really kind of acknowledging that and kind of bringing that out more, not in a kind of an acting out way, but when there's so much hostility, when there's so much rage, we can act that in against ourselves, and it can kind of really make us very kind of physically sick. So I'd say, as much as possible, I'd say getting support with that is really important, and kind of trying to let that go as much as possible is really important as well, because I think it really kind of gets in the way of having kind of healthy relationships. That kind of level of hostility that we can kind of carry. So we could do another whole podcast in that, Simon, but
Well, let's do that. Yeah. Um, just one question's just popped into my head because you mentioned IFS. We've done quite a lot of conversations with IFS about IFS with IFS coaches and stuff recently. Um, I'm just wondering if you talked about this our inherent health being a driver. And I think that might be a really good topic if you're up for doing another podcast maybe next year. Um, is there any way that you can put the uppercase S self of IFS, our true self, our essence,
Yeah.
what some people might call spirit, what other people might call consciousness, is does that sit does that uppercase S self, does that sit with inherent health for you, or are
Yeah,
they different?
it is, it does, because inherent health is kind of a bit like what's inherent or what's organic in us. And self, they talk about in IFS, if you're in self, you're responding to yourself, and you're responding to other people with kind of qualities like compassion,
Yeah,
curiosity, confidence, all these. And these are all these are all kind of organic qualities, and it's all part of our inherent health. But when we've been traumatized, then, to deal with the trauma in a way, we kind of disconnect from the trauma, but we also disconnect from our inherent health. So the stuff gets in the way. So it's exactly the same, I think. You're
okay.
in the same ballpark.
So the trauma obscures the inherent health.
Yeah,
It
we have to
conceals it.
yeah, we have to so we have to adapt to the trauma. And one of the ways we adapt to trauma is by disconnecting. But unfortunately, we disconnect from the trauma, but we also disconnect to what's organic in us and what's, our
Yeah.
inherent health.
And nobody's told us about this inherent health.
Yeah,
And nobody's told us about this uppercase S self until we stumble upon IFS, right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
inherent health is a very, very powerful idea, because it really kind of means no matter how traumatized you become, that you don't lose what's kind of organic in you. And
Indeed.
that's why, you even see people on medication, that they have to keep going on more and more medication a lot of the time, because inherent health is always trying to come true. Like
Yeah.
no matter how, like, even if you look at it, no matter how long we've been in these kind of states of fight, flight, or freeze, our biology prefers, as a preference for safety and social engagement. So with the right conditions, meeting the right person, or inherent health will start coming through. So it's a real inherent health is a real kind of hopeful idea.
Yeah. The you mentioned flowers earlier on, and the image that came to my mind is I remember having the front of our drive tarmac when I was a kid, and I love the smell of tarmac for some reason. Tarmac in creosote, strange. I don't know why am I saying this. Anyway, but I remember seeing a flower. There's this there's this however many tons and however thick this layer of tarmac was. I don't know, um, 4 inches thick maybe. And the flower, the tiny little flower, had burst through the tarmac, and that was the metaphor that came to my mind as you were talking about this inherent.
Exactly. That kind of tar can be like the trauma. No matter how much the trauma is there, that inherent health will always it's always kind of looking for.
Yeah,
It's a kind of it's a kind of like an organic intelligence, really.
and yeah, and the inherent health. I'm also thinking about the idea that a lot of early what's the paradigm? So he comes from a sickness. Mental health came from was mental sickness, wasn't it? Like physical health was about sickness and disease, and that model came across to the mental state. So it was about mental disease, and it's not about that anymore. It's about mental health and inherent health. it's a change of the paradigm and a function of what's gone before.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Brilliant. Thanks, Liam.
Listen,
Thanks,
thank
Liam.
you. I'll have to go because I have to collect my wife from shopping.
Yeah. Cheers, Liam. Thanks,
Listen,
listeners. Goodbye.
take care and lovely talking to you, Simon.
Lovely talking to you too. Thanks,
Take
Liam.
care.
Bye. Cheers.
Bye
Bye.
bye.